September 1944. A staff car carrying General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, newly reappointed commander of German forces in the West, rolled through the devastated French countryside toward his headquarters. The 69-year-old Prussian aristocrat, called out of retirement for the third time, stared through rain-streaked windows at an impossible sight. An unbroken stream of American trucks stretched from horizon to horizon, moving with mechanical precision along roads his armies had travelled on foot and horseback just months before. Tens of thousands of vehicles in formations so vast they defied comprehension. Von Rundstedt turned to his aide, Hauptmann Werner Pluskat, and spoke words that would be recorded in Pluskat's diary. "They are not fighting a war, they are running a delivery service. How does one defeat a nation that treats war like a business operation?" This contempt for American logistics was not new. German military tradition, forged over centuries of European warfare, prized tactical brilliance, operational audacity, and the martial spirit of the individual soldier. The idea that a war could be won through truck production seemed absurd to officers trained in the theories of Clausewitz and Moltke. Yet, what von Rundstedt witnessed that rainy September day was the physical manifestation of a revolution in warfare that German planning had failed to anticipate. The American military was about to move entire armies across a continent at speeds that would have seemed like science fiction just a decade earlier, and they would do it primarily with a single vehicle that German generals had dismissed as crude, unsophisticated, and typical of American industrial excess. The Dodge WC and the GMC CCKW, the 6x6 trucks that would collectively be known simply as Jimmy or Deuce and a Half. The story of how American trucks defeated German tactical genius begins not in 1944, but in 1940, when the United States Army faced a crisis that most Americans never knew existed. The German blitzkrieg through France had revealed a terrifying truth. Modern mechanized warfare moved faster than traditional logistics could support. German panzer divisions had raced across France while their supply columns, still largely horse-drawn, struggled to keep pace. The Wehrmacht's solution was to live off captured supplies and accept that deep penetrations would outrun their logistics, a gamble that worked in France but would prove catastrophic in Russia. The Americans, watching from across the Atlantic, drew different conclusions. If future war would be mechanized, then logistics must be mechanized as well. Not partially, not predominantly, completely. Every ton of supplies, every gallon of fuel, every replacement soldier must move by motor vehicle. It was an audacious concept that required a vehicle that didn't yet exist. Something rugged enough for off-road combat conditions, simple enough for mass production, standardized enough for universal maintenance, and reliable enough to operate without the extensive support infrastructure that German vehicles required. The specifications issued by the United States Army Quartermaster Corps in early 1940 seemed almost impossible. A 6-wheel drive truck capable of carrying 2.5 tons off-road, 5 tons on roads, able to ford streams up to 30 inches deep, capable of climbing 60% grades, simple enough that a soldier with basic mechanical knowledge could perform field repairs, reliable enough to operate for months without depot-level maintenance, and most impossibly, cheap enough to produce by the tens of thousands. General Brehon Somervell, commanding general of Army Service Forces, understood what was being asked. He later recalled in his 1945 testimony to Congress that military planners wanted a vehicle that could be driven by a private, fixed by a corporal, and built by the millions. We were asking industry to create something that had never existed. A truck tough enough for combat, simple enough for mass production, and reliable enough to build an empire upon. Most manufacturers thought we were insane. The response from American industry proved Somervell's critics wrong. By 1941, multiple manufacturers had prototypes in testing. General Motors Corporation, specifically their truck division GMC, and Chrysler Corporation's Dodge division, emerged with winning designs. The GMC CCKW, officially designated as a 2.5-ton 6x6 cargo truck, and the Dodge WC series, covering various configurations from weapons carriers to ambulances. Both vehicles shared the revolutionary feature that made American logistics possible. 6-wheel drive with all wheels powered. The engineering was deceptively simple, which was exactly the point. A 6-cylinder engine producing roughly 90 horsepower. Not impressive by performance standards, but reliable and fuel efficient. a 5-speed manual transmission with a 2-speed transfer case, giving 10 forward gears for varying terrain, 3 axles with all wheels driven, providing traction that 2-wheel drive vehicles couldn't match, an open cab design that sacrificed crew comfort for simplicity and all-weather operation, and most critically, standardized components that could be interchanged between vehicles and even between manufacturers. Major James Thayer, who served as a logistics officer in the Quartermaster Corps, described the design philosophy in a 1946 technical paper. "We didn't want the best truck. We wanted the good enough truck that could be everywhere. German trucks were marvels of engineering, Maybach engines, sophisticated suspensions, precision components. They were also impossible to maintain in field conditions and required parts that didn't exist outside Germany. Our trucks were designed around the assumption that they would break, and they would be fixed by teenagers with wrenches in a muddy field in France. That requirement drove every design decision. Production began in earnest in 1941, and the numbers quickly became staggering. The GMC plant in Pontiac, Michigan, was producing 500 trucks per day by 1942. Dodge facilities in Detroit and surrounding areas matched this output. At peak production in 1944, American factories were completing a new 2.5-ton truck every 2 minutes, 24 hours a day. The total production by war's end exceeded 812,000 units, with GMC producing approximately 562,000 and Dodge contributing 250,000. Each truck required 2,500 individual parts, 40 feet of rubber hose, 150 feet of electrical wiring, and 400 pounds of steel. Yet American workers, utilizing mass production techniques perfected by the automotive industry, assembled these vehicles with precision that exceeded pre-war standards. Women comprised nearly 40% of the workforce in truck production by 1943, many having never worked in manufacturing before Pearl Harbor. Quality control was obsessive. Every engine was test run before installation. Every vehicle underwent a complete function test before leaving the factory. Rejection rates for defective components were higher during wartime than in peacetime production. The ammunition production supporting this truck fleet was equally impressive. Each truck consumed fuel at a rate of roughly 5 miles per gallon under combat conditions. With hundreds of thousands of vehicles operating, fuel consumption exceeded 1 million gallons per day in the European theatre alone. This fuel had to be transported from ports to forward dumps, a task performed by the trucks themselves. The entire system was a logistical feedback loop where trucks transported the fuel needed to power trucks, transporting supplies needed by armies that protected the supply lines. While American factories churned out standardized trucks, German production remained fragmented across hundreds of different vehicle types from dozens of manufacturers. The Wehrmacht operated over 2,000 different vehicle models by 1943, each requiring unique parts and specialized maintenance. German trucks like the Opel Blitz were excellent vehicles, superior to American designs in many individual specifications, but they couldn't be produced in sufficient numbers, maintained in field conditions, or supplied with spare parts once deep in enemy territory. General der Panzertruppe Heinz Guderian, architect of German Blitzkrieg doctrine, recognized this weakness but couldn't overcome it. In his 1944 memorandum to Hitler regarding production priorities, he wrote that German armoured divisions were hobbled not by tank shortages, but by the lack of trucks to supply them. "We have created a spearhead without a shaft. Our panzer divisions can advance 50 kilometers in a day, but our supply columns can move only 20. The gap grows daily until the advance stops not from enemy action, but from empty fuel tanks." The Americans have solved this problem. Their trucks are crude, but they exist in numbers we cannot match. The first major test of American truck logistics came in North Africa. Operation Torch, the November 1942 invasion, put American supply doctrine to its first real test. The results were mixed. Trucks performed well mechanically, but American logistics planning proved naive. Units arrived without sufficient spare parts, maintenance personnel lacked experience, and the sheer distances involved in North African operations exceeded pre-war planning assumptions. Lieutenant Colonel John Moorman, serving as a logistics officer with the 1st Armoured Division, recorded in his after-action report that early operations revealed critical gaps. "We had trucks, thousands of them, but we didn't understand how to employ them systematically. Units hoarded vehicles, supply discipline was non-existent, and we wasted capacity through inefficient loading and poor route planning. The Germans, despite having fewer trucks, initially moved supplies more efficiently because they had experience we lacked. The North African campaign became America's logistics school. Hard lessons learned in the Tunisian desert would reshape how the army employed its truck fleet. Centralized motor transport battalions replaced unit organic vehicles, allowing for more efficient allocation of resources. Standardized loading procedures maximized cargo capacity. Maintenance units were reorganized to provide forward repair capability, reducing deadlining rates. Most importantly, staff officers learned to calculate logistics as precisely as they planned combat operations. By the time of the Sicily invasion in July 1943, American logistics had evolved dramatically. Motor transport battalions, each consisting of roughly 150 trucks, operated as semi-independent units that could be allocated to support specific operations. The Red Ball Express, though most famous in France, had its origins in Sicily, where dedicated truck routes with priority traffic flow first proved their worth. Major General John Lee, commanding Service of Supply in the Mediterranean Theatre, wrote in his October 1943 report that Sicily demonstrated that properly organised motor transport could support operations that traditional logistics theory said were impossible. We moved the equivalent of a corps-sized force across an island, with limited roads and no rail network in a fraction of the time our planning factors suggested. The trucks, operating in organised convoys with centralised control, achieved utilisation rates exceeding 90%. This was the moment we realised we had a weapon the Germans couldn't match. The true test came with Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. Planning for D-Day required calculating logistics at a scale never before attempted. The initial invasion force alone required 5,000 tons of supplies per day. Within a month, with multiple divisions ashore, daily requirements would exceed 20,000 tons. All of this had to move from beaches with limited capacity, over a road network that would be contested and likely damaged, to combat units potentially hundreds of miles inland. Rear Admiral William Glassford, serving as logistics coordinator for the naval component of Overlord, later testified that the planning phase revealed just how revolutionary American logistics had become. British planners, working from traditional calculations based on their experiences in North Africa and Italy, initially estimated that we could support perhaps 15 divisions in France before logistics constraints halted operations. American planners, calculating based on motor transport capacity rather than traditional supply line lengths, projected we could support over 40 divisions. The British thought we were mad. Our numbers seemed impossible by every historical standard. But we had something history had never seen before: unlimited trucks and the industrial capacity to keep them running. The invasion plan called for 57,000 vehicles to land in the first 40 days, with trucks comprising the majority. These vehicles would immediately begin operating in an organised system designed before the first soldier hit the beach. The Transportation Corps, a branch created in 1942 specifically to manage military logistics, had developed detailed plans for port operations, convoy routing, traffic control and maintenance support. D-Day itself, June 6, 1944, saw the system's first test. As troops secured the beaches, trucks began rolling off landing craft directly into combat. The iconic image of trucks driving through surf while under fire illustrated the American approach to logistics. There was no pause to organise, no waiting for perfect conditions. Supplies moved forward immediately, continuously, relentlessly. General Major Max Pemsel, Chief of Staff of the German 7th Army defending Normandy, watched the American build-up with growing alarm. His daily intelligence summaries captured after the war show increasing disbelief at American supply capacity. June 10th entry notes that American vehicle concentration exceeds anything seen on the Eastern Front. June 15th reports that supply dumps are appearing faster than they can be targeted. By June 20th, Pemsel's summary states flatly that the Americans are building a logistics infrastructure that makes a war of attrition unwinnable for Germany. The breakout from Normandy in late July 1944, Operation Cobra, demonstrated what mechanized logistics could achieve. General Omar Bradley's First Army, supported by Patton's newly operational Third Army, smashed through German lines at Saint-Lô and began a pursuit that would cover 400 miles in 26 days. This advance, faster than any in military history to that point, was made possible entirely by trucks. The famous Red Ball Express, operating from August 25th to November 16th, 1944, became the symbol of American logistics prowess. Dedicated truck routes marked with red balls carried supplies exclusively for forward units. At peak operation, 5,900 vehicles operated on the red ball, moving 12,500 tons of supplies daily. Trucks ran 24 hours a day, with drivers often at the wheel for 20 hours straight. The roads became rivers of olive drab flowing endlessly eastward. The statistics were staggering. Trucks travelled at an average speed of 25 miles per hour on routes where traffic was one-way only. Round trips from Normandy beaches to forward dumps near the German border covered over 600 miles. Fuel consumption, by the trucks themselves, consumed roughly 300,000 gallons daily, meaning that a significant portion of cargo was fuel for the trucks. Yet the system worked. American armies advanced faster than German forces could retreat, supplied entirely by motor transport operating over roads that traditional military theory said couldn't support such operations. Staff Sergeant Bill Kinnard, a driver with the 35th 7th Quartermaster Truck Company, part of the Red Ball Express, described the experience in a 1945 interview. "We drove until we couldn't see straight. Sleep was what you got in the passenger seat while your co-driver took the wheel. The roads were marked every few miles with red balls painted on signs, so you knew you were en route. MPs controlled every intersection, keeping traffic moving. If you broke down, you pulled off immediately. Recovery vehicles would get you, but nothing stopped the flow. We moved entire armies with trucks that cost less than a single artillery piece. The Germans couldn't understand it. They were still using horses. German commanders watching the American advance struggled to comprehend what they were seeing. General Oberst Alfred Jodl, chief of the German Armed Forces Operations Staff, wrote in his war diary that American logistics appeared to violate the known laws of supply. Traditional military calculations suggested that armies operating 400 miles from their supply base should be experiencing critical shortages and slowing down. Instead, American units maintained combat power even as they raced across France. The only explanation was that American truck capacity exceeded German intelligence estimates by a factor of 5 to 10. The weather began to deteriorate in September 1944, and with it came the first real challenge to American truck logistics. The same rains that turned European roads to mud affected American trucks as severely as German vehicles. But here, American production capacity provided the answer. When trucks bogged down, more trucks were dispatched. When roads became impassable, engineers used trucks to transport road-building materials to construct new routes. The solution to every logistics problem was more trucks, and America had more trucks. Operation Market Garden, the ambitious but ultimately failed attempt to cross the Rhine in September 1944, illustrated both the capabilities and limitations of truck logistics. The plan required supplying a narrow corridor stretching 60 miles into German-held territory. American and British truck units performed magnificently, moving supplies forward under constant German attack. But the operation failed because air transport, not ground logistics, couldn't deliver sufficient reinforcement to airborne troops. The trucks had done everything asked of them. By October 1944, the American truck fleet in Europe exceeded 450,000 vehicles. The Transportation Corps had organized these into a system of staggering complexity. Motor transport battalions operated in tiers. Long-haul battalions moved supplies from ports to forward distribution centers. Medium-haul units carried supplies from distribution centers to army dumps. Short-haul companies delivered supplies from army dumps to divisions. Each tier operated with precision timing, creating a conveyor belt of supplies that never stopped moving. The maintenance infrastructure supporting this fleet was itself a marvel. Ordnance companies operated mobile repair facilities that could perform engine replacements in the field. Parts supply operated on an exchange basis. Damaged components were removed and replaced with rebuilt parts, with repairs performed at rear area facilities. This system kept deadlining rates below 10%, meaning that over 90% of trucks were operational at any given time. German forces had nothing comparable. Luftwaffe pilot Lieutenant Hans Weiss, shot down and captured in October 1944, was transported to a prisoner of war camp by truck convoy. His interrogation report included observations about American logistics that stunned German intelligence. "I saw truck convoys that stretched for 30 kilometers. They moved day and night without stopping. At rest areas, maintenance crews swarmed over vehicles performing repairs while drivers slept in tents beside the road. Everything was organized with factory precision. I asked my guard how many trucks the Americans had. He laughed and said, "Nobody knows, we just keep building them." That's when I understood Germany had lost. The German Ardennes offensive in December 1944, known as the Battle of the Bulge, provided the ultimate test of American logistics. Hitler's plan depended on capturing American fuel dumps to sustain the German advance, acknowledging implicitly that German logistics couldn't support offensive operations. The offensive initially succeeded in creating a massive bulge in American lines, threatening to split Allied armies. The American response showcased everything learned about mechanized logistics. Within 48 hours, Eisenhower's headquarters had organized a massive redeployment. Patton's Third Army, operating in the Saar region 100 miles south of the breakthrough, was ordered to disengage, turn 90 degrees, and attack into the German flank. This maneuver, involving 6 divisions totaling over 100,000 men with all their equipment and supplies, had to be completed in less than a week. What followed was the greatest road march in military history. The Transportation Corps routed 1,500 convoys totaling over 60,000 vehicles through a road network partially controlled by German forces. Traffic control was managed with military precision. Routes were designated for specific divisions. MPs controlled every intersection. Fuel dumps were positioned every 50 miles. Maintenance units established checkpoints to pull damaged vehicles before they blocked roads. In 72 hours, Patton's entire army was in position and attacking, supplied continuously by trucks operating in conditions that German logistics had never operated in successfully. General Major Otto Remmer, commanding the Führer Escort Brigade during the Ardennes offensive, witnessed the American redeployment with disbelief. We had achieved surprise, broken through their lines, and were advancing toward the Meuse. We expected weeks before they could respond in force. Instead, within days, entire American armies appeared in our flank. Not scattered units rushing to plug gaps, but organized divisions with full supplies, artillery, ammunition, everything. Their trucks brought entire armies to battle faster than we could reposition battalions. At that moment, every German officer understood the war was lost. The statistics of the Bulge redeployment define its scale. In 9 days, American trucks moved 250,000 men, 50,000 vehicles, and 100,000 tons of supplies over distances averaging 150 miles. Daily fuel consumption exceeded 2 million gallons. Ammunition expenditure required 5,000 truck trips daily just to maintain supply. The wounded, over 80,000 by the battle's end, were evacuated using the same truck fleet moving supplies forward. The entire operation ran continuously in sub-zero temperatures, on icy roads, under German air attack, and maintained combat effectiveness throughout. The Dodge and GMC trucks performed heroically. Many vehicles operated for 48 hours straight without shutdown. Maintenance was performed while vehicles idled, with mechanics working in temperatures that froze tools to bare hands. The simple, overbuilt design that German engineers had mocked proved its worth. When sophisticated components failed, they could be bypassed. When parts weren't available, field expedients worked. The trucks kept running because they were designed to keep running. Captain Charles MacDonald, commanding a rifle company in the 2nd Infantry Division during the Bulge, wrote in his memoir about the truck convoys that sustained his unit. Every night trucks appeared through the snow. They brought ammunition, food, mail, replacement soldiers, everything. The drivers were exhausted, often so tired they fell asleep while crews unloaded. But they came every night without fail. We joked that you could set your watch by the supply trucks. The Germans could shell the roads, strafe the convoys, block routes with obstacles, it didn't matter. More trucks always came. That reliability, that absolute certainty that supplies would arrive, was worth an extra division in combat power. By January 1945, the German offensive had collapsed, destroyed not primarily by American combat power, but by logistics failure. German spearheads ran out of fuel, miles short of captured supply dumps. Ammunition shortages meant that German artillery fell silent, while American guns fired without restriction. German wounded lay in the snow because the Wehrmacht lacked vehicles to evacuate them. American wounded were in field hospitals within hours, transported by the same trucks that brought forward ammunition. The final drive into Germany showcased American logistics at peak efficiency. As Allied armies crossed the Rhine in March 1945, the truck fleet supporting operations exceeded 500,000 vehicles. The Transportation Corps moved an average of 800,000 tons of supplies per month, equivalent to the cargo capacity of 800 Liberty ships. Everything from tank treads to typewriter ribbons, from aviation fuel to artificial limbs, moved by truck. The scale was overwhelming. Daily operations required 20 million gallons of fuel, 50,000 tons of ammunition, 30,000 tons of food, 5,000 tons of spare parts, and thousands of miscellaneous items. All of this moved on trucks operating on a road network damaged by years of war. Yet delivery rates exceeded 95%. Units received supplies so reliably that they stopped maintaining reserve stocks, confident that tomorrow's convoy would arrive. Oberst Hans von Luck, commanding a Panzer Grenadier regiment in the defense of Germany, experienced the collapse of German logistics firsthand. His memoirs describe the contrast between German and American supply situations. By April 1945, my regiment was immobilized. We had tanks without fuel, guns without ammunition, soldiers without food. 10 kilometers away, American units operated with obvious surplus. Their vehicles were everywhere, their dumps overflowing, their soldiers well fed and equipped. We joked bitterly that we should surrender just to get a ride in an American truck. The tragedy was that German soldiers were still brave and willing, but bravery without bullets is meaningless. The Americans won by burying us under a mountain of supplies delivered by ugly, simple, unstoppable trucks. The statistics of American logistics in Europe define the scale of achievement. From June 1944 to May 1945, American trucks transported over 7 million tons of supplies. They moved 4 million personnel. They evacuated 800,000 wounded. They consumed over 500 million gallons of fuel, transporting fuel to combat units. The truck fleet drove over 5 billion miles, equivalent to 200,000 trips around the Earth. All of this was accomplished with vehicles that cost approximately $2,000 each to produce. German equipment costs provided stark contrast. A German Opel Blitz truck cost roughly 8,000 Reichsmarks to produce, about $3,200 in 1944 exchange rates, but production numbers were incomparable. Germany produced roughly 100,000 trucks of all types during 1944. America produced that many in 6 weeks. The cost advantage of standardization and mass production meant that America could afford to lose trucks by the thousands and replace them immediately. After Germany's surrender, captured German generals were extensively interrogated about their failure to anticipate American logistics capability. General Oberst Alfred Jodel's interrogation in June 1945 revealed fundamental miscalculation. We knew America had vast industrial capacity, but we assumed they would build tanks, aircraft, artillery, the weapons that win battles. We never imagined they would focus equal effort on trucks. In German military thinking, logistics was something you managed with captured equipment and improvisation. The idea of purpose-building hundreds of thousands of vehicles just to move supplies seemed wasteful. This was our greatest strategic error. The Americans didn't just supply their armies better than we supplied ours. They supplied their armies better than we thought possible. Their trucks didn't win battles directly, but they made every American soldier more effective by ensuring he always had ammunition, food, fuel, and support. A German soldier with empty magazines facing an American with full supplies will lose regardless of courage or skill. The Pacific Theatre told a similar story with different challenges. Distances were measured in thousands of miles, infrastructure was non-existent on most islands, and tropical conditions destroyed equipment with ruthless efficiency. Yet American trucks performed equally well. The GMC CCKW, with its high ground clearance and waterproof electrical system, operated in jungles that European trucks couldn't traverse. During the Philippines campaign, American trucks drove through rivers, up volcanic slopes, and across temporary bridges built specifically to support truck traffic. Major General Edmund Levy, commanding logistics operations in the Southwest Pacific Theatre, wrote in his final report that Pacific operations proved American trucks could operate anywhere. We drove trucks across islands that didn't have roads. We operated in heat that melted German vehicles. We forded rivers that submerged vehicles up to the cab. The trucks took everything the Pacific could throw at them and kept running. Japanese forces, still largely dependent on porters and pack animals, couldn't compete. We moved divisions in days across terrain that would have taken them weeks. The China-Burma-India theatre provided the most extreme test of American truck logistics. The Ledo Road, constructed specifically to supply Chinese forces fighting Japan, required trucks to operate at altitudes exceeding 10,000 feet, on roads that were often just carved ledges on mountainsides. The route from Ledo in India to Kunming in China covered over 1,000 miles through some of the world's most hostile terrain. Brigadier General Lewis Pick, chief engineer of the Ledo Road construction, called it the most difficult logistics operation ever attempted. We were building a road through mountains, jungles and swamps simultaneously, then immediately using it to haul supplies before construction was even finished. Trucks operated on roads so narrow that meeting oncoming traffic required one vehicle to back up for miles. Monsoon rains turned sections into rivers of mud, yet the trucks kept moving. At peak operation, we were delivering 6,000 tons monthly to China, entirely by truck, over roads that shouldn't have been passable. The iconic photo of American trucks on the Ledo Road, spaced at precise intervals on a mountainside switchback, illustrated both the achievement and the method. Every 100 feet of vertical gain required a mile of road. Trucks climbed grades that commercial vehicles would refuse. Loads were calculated to the pound to prevent vehicles from tipping on corners. Yet traffic moved continuously, creating a supply line that crossed the Himalayas. Chinese nationalist General Sun Li-jen, commanding forces supplied via the Ledo Road, told American liaison officers that Chinese soldiers called American trucks machines of victory. They bring everything: food, medicine, ammunition, even mail from families. Before American trucks, Chinese armies lived off the land and fought with whatever ammunition we could carry. Now we fight like modern armies because American trucks bring us the supplies to do so. The trucks matter more than the tanks because trucks make everything else possible. By war's end, American truck production totaled over 2.4 million vehicles of all types. The 2.5-ton 6x6 represented just 1/3 of this total, but the impact was disproportionate. These trucks became the backbone of logistics operations that moved supplies farther, faster, and more reliably than any previous system in military history. Post-war analysis by military historians revealed that American trucks provided strategic advantage equivalent to having twice as many combat divisions. The ability to supply forces continuously meant that American units fought at full effectiveness, while Axis forces scrounged for basics. Ammunition expenditure comparisons were stark. An American infantry division in Europe fired roughly twice as much artillery ammunition as a German division, not because American doctrine required it, but because American logistics could support it. German artillery commanders husbanded shells they couldn't replace, while American gunners fired without restriction because tomorrow's convoy would bring more. The British military, fighting alongside American forces, developed enormous respect for American logistics. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, despite his complicated relationship with American commanders, wrote in his memoirs that American supply superiority was the decisive factor in Allied victory. British armies fought well, but we fought at the end of supply lines that stretched back to Britain. American armies fought with supplies that seemed unlimited because their trucks could move entire depots forward daily. I learned to plan operations based not on what logistics theory said was possible, but on what American trucks could actually deliver. Those calculations were often double what British logistics could achieve. The Soviet Union, recipient of massive American Lend-Lease aid, received over 400,000 trucks through the program. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, commanding Soviet forces through their greatest victories, later stated in his memoirs that American trucks enabled Soviet offensives that otherwise wouldn't have been possible. Soviet industry produced tanks and guns. American industry provided the trucks that moved our armies. Without those trucks, we could not have pursued the Germans as relentlessly as we did. They allowed us to maintain momentum that never gave the Germans time to stabilize defenses. The cost effectiveness was remarkable. A 2.5-ton truck cost approximately $2,000 to produce in 1944. It could transport its purchase price worth of supplies in a single trip. Over its service life, typically 50,000 miles before requiring depot-level maintenance, each truck moved supplies worth hundreds of times its own cost. The return on investment exceeded that of almost any other military equipment. German generals, in post-war interrogations and memoirs, consistently identified American logistics as the fundamental reason for Allied victory. General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, in a 1946 interview, stated that German armies were defeated not by better tactics or braver soldiers, but by an avalanche of supplies delivered by trucks that never stopped coming. We won battles and lost the war because America built trucks instead of monuments. Those ugly, simple machines were worth more than all our tactical brilliance. Every German soldier knew that when he heard American truck engines, defeat was approaching. Not immediately, perhaps, but inevitably, because those trucks brought everything the Americans needed to win. The Jimmy and Deuce and a half served far beyond 1945. Surplus vehicles filled civilian roles worldwide, becoming the foundation of trucking industries in dozens of countries. Modified versions served in Korea, Vietnam, and conflicts into the 1990s. Many remain in service today with militaries and civilians who value reliability over sophistication. At the United States Army Transportation Museum at Fort Eustis, Virginia, a restored GMC CCKW sits prominently displayed. Its placard lists technical specifications, but the real story is told by a map on the wall behind it, showing the routes American trucks travelled during World War II. Red lines trace paths across Europe, through Pacific jungles, over Himalayan mountains, across African deserts. The lines cover the world, carried by trucks that German generals had dismissed as crude and unsophisticated. Below the map is a quote from Generaloberst Alfred Jodel's final interrogation in 1945, weeks before his trial at Nuremberg. "We studied American aircraft, analysed their tanks, feared their artillery. We never imagined their trucks would defeat us, but that is what happened. Germany was conquered by assembly lines we didn't know existed, building vehicles we didn't think mattered. The Americans won the war in Detroit and Pontiac and Flint, not in Berlin and Rome and Tokyo. Their secret weapon wasn't atomic bombs or radar or code breaking, it was trucks. Simple, ugly, unstoppable trucks that turned warfare into a delivery service. Von Rundstedt was right. They weren't fighting a war, they were running a business, and business was very good." The transformation of military logistics from horse-drawn columns to mechanized supply chains happened in less than 5 years, compressed by the urgency of global war. American trucks didn't just participate in this transformation, they defined it. The doctrine, organization, and methods developed to employ hundreds of thousands of trucks became the foundation for modern military logistics. Every major military in the world today operates on principles proven by American trucks in World War II. Supplies move by motor vehicle on planned routes managed by traffic control. Maintenance is performed by specialized units using standardized parts. Consumption is calculated precisely, and convoys dispatched to meet requirements. The system that von Rundstedt watched rolling across France in 1944 is recognizable in military logistics operations today. The GMC CCKW and Dodge WC series were more than vehicles. They were the physical manifestation of American industrial philosophy applied to warfare. Standardization over customization, reliability over performance, quantity and quality achieved through mass production. These principles, proven by trucks, would reshape how America approached military procurement for generations. The German generals who mocked American trucks in 1943 as examples of crude industrial excess had failed to understand a fundamental truth. In modern war, the side that can deliver more supplies to more places more reliably will win. Tactical brilliance matters, strategic vision matters, but logistics capacity matters more. The Americans understood this instinctively, built their military accordingly, and delivered victory by the truckload. The thunder of American artillery that terrified German soldiers, the swarms of American aircraft that dominated the skies, the masses of American armor that overwhelmed German defenses, all depended absolutely on trucks that no one celebrated and few remember. The real heroes of American logistics weren't the famous generals or celebrated units. They were 20-year-old kids driving Jimmies through the night, every night for months, getting supplies forward so that someone else could fight. They were the mechanics who kept vehicles running despite conditions that should have destroyed them. They were the planners who calculated routes and loads and timing with precision that made the impossible routine. German military tradition celebrated the decisive battle, the brilliant maneuver, the heroic last stand. American military practice focused on sustainable logistics, reliable delivery, and overwhelming material superiority. The clash between these philosophies was decided not in dramatic battles, but in endless convoys of trucks that simply would not stop. The Americans didn't fight the war the Germans expected. They fought the war American industry could win, and they won it with trucks. The broader implications of American truck logistics extended far beyond simple transportation. The psychological impact on German forces was profound and often overlooked in traditional military histories. Wehrmacht soldiers on both fronts developed what medical officers documented as a specific anxiety response to the sound of approaching American vehicle columns. The low rumble of hundreds of engines, audible for miles, became associated with inevitable defeat. Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann, a rifleman in the 352nd Infantry Division who fought from Normandy to the Ruhr, kept a detailed diary throughout his service. His entries from late 1944 reveal the mental deterioration caused by facing an enemy with unlimited supplies. November 3, 1944, we have 30 rounds of ammunition per man, no hot food for 4 days, and our anti-tank gun has been abandoned for lack of shells. Across the valley we watch American trucks arrive in columns that take an hour to pass. They unload supplies in quantities that seem impossible. Fresh uniforms, hot meals, ammunition crates stacked like firewood. Our officers tell us to hold, but how does one hold against an enemy who can afford to fire 10 shells for every one of ours? The trucks break our spirit as much as their artillery breaks our positions. This psychological warfare through logistics abundance was unintentional, but devastatingly effective. German prisoners of war consistently reported that the sheer scale of American supply operations convinced them Germany couldn't win long before battlefield defeats made it obvious. The sight of truck convoys stretching beyond the horizon, of supply dumps the size of small towns, of vehicles so numerous they seemed disposable, undermined German morale more effectively than propaganda ever could. Lieutenant Franz Weber, a company commander in the 12th SS Panzer Division, surrendered his unit in April 1945 not because they were surrounded or out of ammunition, but because he concluded continued resistance was pointless. His interrogation report explained his reasoning. We had fought for 5 years. We had defeated France, conquered most of Europe, pushed deep into Russia. We were good soldiers with good equipment and good leaders. But in 6 months facing the Americans, we learned that none of that mattered. They had more of everything. Every day brought more American trucks, more supplies, more proof that we were fighting a nation that treated this war as a minor industrial inconvenience. My men were starving, wearing rags, firing captured weapons because our supply system had collapsed. American soldiers we captured carried chocolate, cigarettes and spare ammunition they considered barely worth keeping. That contrast killed German fighting spirit more effectively than bullets. The administrative achievement behind American truck logistics was as impressive as the industrial production. The Transportation Corps, operating from offices in Paris by late 1944, managed vehicle movements across Europe with precision that rivaled pre-war commercial logistics operations. Radio networks coordinated convoys in real time. Teletype systems transmitted supply requests from frontline units to depots in hours. Mechanical calculators processed transportation requirements, optimizing loads and routes to maximize efficiency. Colonel Ross Calvert, chief of the motor transport service in the European theatre, oversaw a staff of 3,000 officers and enlisted personnel whose sole job was coordinating truck movements. His 1945 efficiency report to the War Department detailed an organization that operated like a transcontinental trucking company. We tracked every vehicle by bumper number. We knew fuel consumption rates for every model under different load and terrain conditions. We calculated optimal convoy sizes based on road capacity, destination supply needs, and maintenance requirements. Dispatchers routed trucks like trains, with scheduled departure times, planned stops, and expected arrival windows. The system moved more tonnage monthly than all American railroads combined carried pre-war, and we did it with greater reliability. The nerve centre of this operation was the Transportation Corps Motor Transport Headquarters in Paris, operating from requisitioned office buildings near Les Invalides. 24 hours a day, staff officers moved coloured pins on maps covering entire walls, each pin representing a convoy of 50 to 100 vehicles. Status boards tracked vehicle maintenance, fuel stocks, ammunition loads, and personnel movements. The operation resembled a stock exchange floor, with officers constantly receiving updates, recalculating priorities, and issuing movement orders. Captain Eleanor Morrison, one of hundreds of Women's Army Corps officers serving in transportation planning, described the scope of coordination required. Every truck in the European theatre was accounted for at any given moment. We knew which convoys were where, what they carried, when they would arrive. When combat operations changed, we could reroute thousands of vehicles within hours. The planning required for a major offensive involved calculating not just what supplies were needed, but how many trucks, how much fuel for those trucks, which routes could handle the traffic, where maintenance support should position, how to stage convoys so they arrived in sequence. It was logistics choreography on a continental scale. The fuel logistics supporting the truck fleet itself represented a staggering secondary supply chain. Each 2.5-ton truck consumed approximately 1 gallon per 5 miles under combat load conditions. With 450,000 trucks operating in Europe by early 1945, daily fuel consumption by the transportation fleet alone exceeded 2 million gallons. This fuel had to be transported from ports to forward dumps by the trucks themselves, creating a complex calculation where roughly 30% of transported fuel powered the transportation system. The petroleum logistics infrastructure built to support this demand rivaled anything in the commercial oil industry. The pipeline under the ocean, codenamed Pluto, pumped fuel directly from England to France, but the majority still moved by truck. 5-gallon jerry cans, copied from captured German designs, became the standard fuel container. Each truck typically carried 4 spare cans, providing 100 miles of emergency range. Fuel trucks, modified with 750-gallon tank bodies, operated in dedicated convoys that took priority over all other traffic. Major Theodore Halloway, a petroleum supply officer with the Quartermaster Corps, calculated that the fuel logistics system consumed roughly 15% of its own capacity, just maintaining operations. We joked that we were running the world's least efficient fuel delivery system because so much fuel powered the delivery trucks. But the inefficiency didn't matter because volume compensated for everything. We could afford to burn a gallon to deliver 3 gallons because we had unlimited supply behind us. The Germans couldn't make that calculation. They had to optimize every gallon because they didn't have enough. We could be wasteful because we had abundance. The spare parts logistics system supporting the truck fleet demonstrated American industrial integration at its finest. Standardized components meant that parts for GMC trucks often fit Dodge vehicles and vice versa. The Ordnance Department maintained parts depots at 3 levels, theatre-level warehouses in rear areas stocking everything, army-level dumps holding fast-moving parts, and mobile maintenance units carrying the most commonly needed items. The most frequently replaced components, tyres, fan belts, spark plugs, oil filters, were pre-positioned at intervals along major supply routes. A truck experiencing mechanical failure could often obtain replacement parts within hours, without formally entering the supply system. Maintenance units operated like pit crews at racing events, swarming over disabled vehicles to get them operational and back in convoy as quickly as possible. Technical Sergeant Michael Kowalski, a maintenance supervisor with the 33rd through 48th Ordnance Company, described the repair tempo during peak operations. We could replace an engine in 90 minutes, complete brake system rebuild in under an hour. The trucks were designed for this. Everything bolted together with standardized fasteners, assemblies swapped as units rather than repaired component by component. We didn't fix trucks, we reconfigured them with replacement parts. A vehicle that threw a rod at 800 could be back in a convoy by 1000 with a replacement engine from stock. Try doing that with a German truck that requires parts machined to order. The statistical analysis of truck maintenance revealed the genius of American design philosophy. The mean time between failures for a GMC CCKW under combat conditions was approximately 3,500 miles. When failure occurred, mean time to repair was under 4 hours for 90% of problems. This meant that the average truck spent less than 5% of its operational life deadlined for maintenance. German trucks, more sophisticated and theoretically more reliable, showed failure rates 3 times higher, with repair times that averaged 12 hours because parts weren't available and repairs required specialized knowledge. The comparison extended to operator training. American truck drivers received approximately 80 hours of instruction, covering basic vehicle operation, convoy procedures, field maintenance, and map reading. German truck drivers often received less than 20 hours of training, and maintenance was handled exclusively by specialized mechanics who weren't always available. The American approach created drivers who could keep their vehicles running under conditions that would have stopped German units cold. Private First Class Robert Takahashi, a Nisei driver with the 452nd Regimental Combat Team, exemplified the capability of trained American drivers. His unit, fighting in Italy, operated in mountainous terrain that destroyed vehicles at triple the normal rate. Takahashi's personnel file noted that he kept his assigned truck operational for 11 months and over 40,000 miles, performing all routine maintenance himself and jury-rigging repairs when parts weren't immediately available. His after-action interview credited the training. "They taught us the truck wasn't just a vehicle, it was our responsibility. I could field strip the carburetor, adjust the timing, replace the water pump. Most of us could. That self-sufficiency kept the trucks running when official maintenance wasn't available." The cultural impact of American trucks extended into occupied territories where civilians encountered American logistics firsthand. French civilians in Normandy, initially terrified by the invasion, quickly recognized that American supply operations brought not just military might but abundance that liberated populations hadn't seen in years. Trucks that transported ammunition forward often carried surplus rations, cigarettes, and medical supplies that found their way to civilian populations. Madame Simone Leclerc, a schoolteacher in Carentan who witnessed the American breakout, recorded her observations in a journal later published as a memoir. The German army had marched through France as conquerors, taking everything, leaving shortages. The American army arrived like a travelling shop. Their trucks were everywhere, and they seemed to have infinite supplies. Soldiers shared chocolate with children, gave cigarettes to men, provided coffee and soap to women. This wasn't official policy, just overflow from an army that had so much it could afford generosity. We understood then that America was a different kind of power, not conquerors hoarding resources, but liberators with so much abundance they could share. This inadvertent soft power projection through logistics abundance influenced post-war European attitudes toward America. The Marshall Plan's success in rebuilding Europe was partly because Europeans had seen American supply capabilities during the war and believed American promises of aid were achievable. The trucks that had delivered military victory became symbols of American capacity to deliver economic recovery. The Soviet experience with American trucks through Lend-Lease provided additional validation of their impact. The Studebaker US-6, a 2.5-ton 6x6 similar to the GMC design, was shipped to the Soviet Union in enormous quantities. Over 150,000 units arrived via the Persian corridor through Iran and via Pacific routes to Vladivostok. Soviet forces, traditionally dependent on horses and limited motor transport, suddenly possessed mechanized logistics capability that transformed operational planning. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky, commanding multiple Soviet fronts, wrote in his memoirs that American trucks enabled Soviet offensive operations that previous logistics would have made impossible. Soviet industry built excellent tanks and artillery, but our truck production was limited and quality was poor. American Studebakers changed everything. Suddenly we could move supplies hundreds of kilometers to support sustained offensives. We could relocate entire armies to exploit breakthroughs. The Germans faced Soviet tactical skill backed by American logistics capability, a combination they couldn't counter. The Studebaker trucks became so valued in Soviet service that they remained in use decades after the war. Soviet soldiers called them Studers and considered them more reliable than domestic vehicles produced in the 1960s. The simple, rugged design that German engineers had criticized proved ideal for Soviet conditions where extreme cold, poor roads, and limited maintenance infrastructure destroyed more sophisticated vehicles. The impact on German logistics became catastrophic, as Allied trucks enabled offensives that destroyed German supply infrastructure faster than it could be rebuilt. The systematic destruction of German rail networks by Allied air power meant that the Wehrmacht became increasingly dependent on truck transport, precisely when truck production was collapsing under bombing and resource shortages. By early 1945, German armies were immobilized not primarily because they lacked combat power, but because they couldn't move supplies forward or retreat quickly enough to establish new defensive lines. General Oberst Heinz Guderian, in his final report to Hitler before being dismissed in March 1945, identified logistics collapse as the primary reason German forces couldn't stabilize the Eastern Front. We are fighting motor-equipped Soviet armies with forces that depend on horses. The contrast is medieval versus modern. Soviet supply columns move at 50 kilometers per day. Ours move at 15. Soviet forces that break through our lines can be supplied indefinitely. Our forces that attempt counterattacks outrun their supplies within 48 hours. This isn't a failure of courage or tactics, it's industrial reality. The Americans gave Stalin the trucks we couldn't build, and those trucks are carrying the Red Army to Berlin. The final collapse of German resistance in both East and West was hastened by complete logistics failure. German units surrendered not because they were defeated in battle, but because they were out of fuel, ammunition and food, with no prospect of resupply. American intelligence officers processing prisoners in April and May 1945 consistently reported that captured German soldiers were surprised by the quantities of supplies American units possessed. A captured German officer, Hauptmann Ernst Becker, commanding a company from the 2nd Panzer Division, was given a meal at a prisoner collection point consisting of hot coffee, beef stew, bread and canned fruit. His interrogator noted that Becker wept while eating, explaining that his men hadn't received hot food in 3 weeks and were down to starvation rations. When shown the supply dump that produced his meal, hundreds of trucks parked in neat rows with supplies stacked in massive piles, Becker's response entered his interrogation file. "We never had a chance. I knew Germany was losing, but I didn't understand why until now. You win by having more of everything. Those trucks brought you victory and brought us defeat. Every truck is worth 10 tanks because tanks without supply are just expensive pillboxes." The strategic bombing campaign against Germany, often analysed in terms of its direct destruction of industrial capacity, had its greatest impact on the mobility differential. German factories, forced underground or dispersed to avoid bombing, could still produce weapons. But the destruction of fuel production facilities and transportation networks meant that weapons couldn't reach the front and vehicles couldn't operate even when fuel existed. American trucks, operating over supply lines protected by Allied air superiority, maintained full effectiveness while German logistics withered. The oil campaign particularly crippled German mobility. Synthetic fuel plants, targeted systematically from May 1944 onward, saw production collapse from 316,000 tons in March 1944 to 17,000 tons by September. This shortage affected German trucks more severely than tanks because trucks consumed more fuel and operated continuously, rather than in short tactical movements. Wehrmacht supply columns began using wood gasification systems, crude devices that generated combustible gas from burning wood, reducing truck speeds to walking pace and cutting payload capacity by half. Oberst Heinrich Meyer, a logistics officer with Army Group B, described the absurdity of German truck operations in early 1945. "We were operating supply convoys powered by wood-burning generators that moved at 10 kilometers per hour. A round trip that should take 8 hours took 36 hours. Meanwhile, American trucks passed us on parallel roads at 50 kilometers per hour, burning fuel so carelessly they left engines idling during stops. The disparity was comical if it weren't tragic. We were reduced to 19th century technology facing 20th century abundance." The human stories behind the truck logistics reveal the diversity of the American war effort. The Red Ball Express, most famously, was operated largely by African American soldiers in segregated transportation units. These soldiers, denied combat roles by military racism, proved essential to Allied victory through their logistics work. The 36th 30th Quartermaster Truck Company, one of dozens of black units operating supply routes, moved over 140,000 tons of supplies in 4 months, more tonnage than crossed the Atlantic in convoy during the First World War. Corporal David Henderson, a driver with the 36th and 30th, described the experience in oral history interviews decades later. "We weren't allowed to fight, but we fought anyway. Fought fatigue, fought German air attacks, fought vehicles that broke down, fought weather that froze our hands to steering wheels. We drove 20 hours straight, slept in truck cabs, ate while driving. The army didn't think black soldiers could handle combat, but somehow we could handle the responsibility of keeping entire armies supplied. Without us, Patton doesn't make his famous dash across France. Without us, the Bulge becomes a German victory. We won the war from behind the wheel, and decades passed before anyone acknowledged it. The contradiction of a segregated army fighting for freedom using black soldiers to deliver the supplies that made victory possible wasn't lost on the participants. Many black soldiers who served in transportation units became civil rights activists after the war, arguing that soldiers who were trusted with the responsibility of keeping armies operational deserved full citizenship rights. The trucks they drove became symbols of their contribution to victory that racism tried to minimize. Women's contributions to truck logistics, both in production and planning, represented another revolutionary aspect of the American war effort. Women comprised nearly 40% of the workforce in truck production facilities, performing jobs from welding chassis to installing engines. The quality control was so rigorous that defect rates actually decreased as women entered the workforce, debunking sexist assumptions about their capabilities. Rose Kravitz, a welding inspector at the GMC Pontiac plant, supervised quality control for cab assemblies. Her personnel file noted that rejection rates for defective welds dropped from 8% to 2% under her supervision. Post-war interviews revealed her philosophy. The boys overseas were depending on these trucks. Every weld I inspected could be the difference between a truck that makes it through combat or one that breaks down and leaves soldiers without supplies. I wasn't just building trucks, I was building the tools of victory. That responsibility made every woman in that plant more careful than any supervisor could enforce. In the Transportation Corps itself, Women's Army Corps officers served as planners, dispatchers, and administrators managing the logistics networks. Their contributions were minimized in official histories but essential to operations. Captain Barbara Wilson, operations officer for the Motor Transport Service in Paris, coordinated convoy movements across France. Her daily logs showed that she regularly routed 500 convoys per day, over 40,000 vehicles, calculating routes, timing, and priorities with precision that male officers acknowledged they couldn't match. Wilson's commanding officer, Colonel Ross Calvert, wrote in her efficiency report that her organisational skills exceeded those of any officer he'd supervised in 25 years of service. Captain Wilson manages complexity that would overwhelm most officers while maintaining accuracy rates approaching 100%. Her work has directly contributed to the success of multiple major operations. The motor transport system functions as smoothly as it does largely because of her planning. She represents the capability and professionalism of Women's Army Corps officers who have proven themselves essential to military operations. The technological evolution of the trucks themselves during the war demonstrated American industrial responsiveness. Early production models had shortcomings that became apparent in combat operations. Electrical systems failed in wet conditions, brakes overheated on long descents, cab designs provided insufficient protection from weather. American engineers, receiving feedback from field units, implemented improvements that were incorporated into production within months. The evolution from the GMC CCKW 352, the initial production model, to the CCKW 353 series showed systematic refinement. Electrical systems were weatherproofed, brake drums were enlarged and vented, cab heaters were added, mirror mounts were reinforced, cargo bed stake pockets were redesigned for easier tarp installation. None of these changes were revolutionary, but collectively they transformed an adequate vehicle into an excellent one. The improvement cycle, from field complaint to design modification to production implementation, averaged less than 6 months. This contrasted sharply with German development processes where improvement suggestions could take years to implement due to bureaucratic procedures and industrial limitations. German trucks like the Opel Blitz remained essentially unchanged from 1940 to 1945 despite known deficiencies because production wasn't feasible under bombing and resource constraints. The specialized variants developed from the basic truck design demonstrated American engineering flexibility. The basic cargo truck was modified into dozens of configurations: tanker trucks for fuel transport, dump trucks for engineering units, wreckers for vehicle recovery, mobile workshops, communications vehicles, and ambulances all shared common components with the standard cargo truck, allowing for simplified maintenance and parts supply. The most innovative variant was arguably the amphibious DUKW, nicknamed the Duck, which combined a GMC truck chassis with a boat hull. This vehicle could drive off landing craft directly onto beaches, drive through surf, then continue inland on roads, eliminating the need to transfer cargo at the waterline. DUKWs delivered over 40% of supplies landed during the Normandy invasion, proving that American engineers could adapt truck technology to solve problems traditional military equipment couldn't address. Major Frederick Schwarting, observing DUKW operations during the Sicily invasion, wrote in his report that the amphibious truck represented American innovation at its best. Traditional military logistics required landing craft to beach, troops to unload cargo onto shore, trucks to load cargo, then trucks to transport inland. Each transfer point created delay and vulnerability. The DUKW eliminated all intermediate steps. Cargo loaded in England could be driven directly to supply dumps miles inland without ever being transferred. This saved thousands of man-hours and reduced the vulnerability of supplies sitting on beaches under German fire. The strategic implications of American truck logistics extended beyond World War II, establishing patterns that defined American military operations for decades. The Korean War, beginning in 1950, saw many of the same World War II trucks still in frontline service. The GMC CCKW and Dodge WC series, designed hastily in 1940, proved so durable and practical that they remained standard equipment a decade later. New variants incorporating lessons from World War II continued production into the 1950s. The concept of mechanized logistics as the foundation of military power became American military doctrine. The ability to project power globally depended on moving supplies reliably over vast distances. This capability, proven by trucks in World War II, became the basis for America's Cold War military strategy. The Soviet Union, despite its size and industrial capacity, never matched American logistics capability because it never fully committed to the mechanization and standardization that made American supply operations so effective. The economic impact of wartime truck production reshaped American industry permanently. Companies like GMC and Dodge, which had been mid-tier automobile manufacturers, emerged from the war as industrial giants with production expertise that translated to commercial success. The engineering talent developed during wartime, the production techniques perfected under pressure, and the quality control systems implemented for military contracts all transferred to civilian production. The interstate highway system, constructed beginning in the 1950s, was justified partly on national defense grounds, but reflected lessons learned about the strategic importance of road networks for military logistics. President Eisenhower, who had commanded the forces supplied by those endless truck convoys, understood that American military power depended on infrastructure that supported mechanized movement. The highways, built ostensibly for civilian use, were designed to military specifications because Eisenhower had seen what proper roads enabled in Europe. The global proliferation of American military surplus trucks after 1945 spread American influence in unexpected ways. Hundreds of thousands of vehicles declared surplus were sold to foreign governments, relief organizations, and commercial buyers. These trucks, built to operate in the worst conditions imaginable, proved ideal for developing nations with poor infrastructure. In countries from Afghanistan to Zambia, American surplus trucks became the backbone of transportation networks. The sight of a GMC Jimmy, or Studebaker US-6, operating in a remote village decades after the war ended became common worldwide. These trucks, built for a war that ended in 1945, were still working in the 1970s and beyond, testament to overbuilt design and simple engineering. Each operating truck served as a reminder of American industrial capacity and inadvertently soft power projection that continued long after military operations ended. The historical analysis of World War II has traditionally focused on dramatic battles, famous generals, and technological breakthroughs like radar or atomic weapons. The trucks that made all of it possible receive footnotes if they're mentioned at all. Yet the honest assessment by German commanders themselves identified logistics as the decisive factor. Germany lost not because its soldiers were inferior, its generals incompetent, or its tactics flawed. Germany lost because it couldn't supply its forces as effectively as America supplied its allies. The mathematics were inexorable. An American infantry division in Europe required roughly 650 tons of supplies daily. American trucks could deliver that tonnage reliably to divisions operating 400 miles from ports. A German division required similar supply quantities, but German logistics could reliably deliver only at distances under 200 miles. This differential meant that American armies could operate from forward positions that German forces couldn't supply, creating a mobility advantage that translated to strategic initiative. The oil equation was similarly stark. American operations consumed over 1 million gallons of fuel daily in the European theatre by late 1944. Roughly 60% of this fuel powered logistics vehicles rather than combat units. This seemed wasteful until one considered that this fuel expenditure enabled delivering the other 40% exactly where needed, when needed. German forces conserving fuel by using horses and limited motor transport couldn't match American operational tempo regardless of tactical skill. The ammunition disparity told perhaps the clearest story. American artillery fired an average of 8 shells for every 1 German shell in the final year of war. This wasn't because American doctrine emphasized artillery more heavily, but because American logistics could deliver ammunition in quantities German logistics couldn't match. German artillery crews with plenty of targets and functioning guns sat silent because supply trucks couldn't bring shells forward. American artillery fired on every target identified, because tomorrow's convoy would replenish ammunition expended today. General George Patton, famous for aggressive armoured operations, understood that his reputation depended entirely on logistics he didn't control and barely understood. His famous quote that, "My men can eat their belts, but my tanks have got to have gas," acknowledged that mobility without supply was useless. Patton's Third Army advanced faster than any comparably sized force in military history, not because Patton was a tactical genius, though he was skilled, but because Transportation Corps officers he never met managed to keep supplies flowing to forces advancing at unprecedented speeds. Colonel Walter Muller, Patton's logistics officer, tried repeatedly to explain to his commander that every mile advanced increased supply line length and reduced delivered tonnage. Patton's response, recorded in Muller's diary, was characteristic. "That's your problem, Colonel. My problem is killing Germans. You figure out how to get me the supplies, I'll figure out where to go with them." Muller's solution was to demand more trucks, shorter delivery cycles, and acceptance that Patton's operations consumed supplies at rates that would have been considered impossible in previous conflicts. The symbiotic relationship between combat units that consumed supplies and logistics units that delivered them created the integrated American war machine. Neither could function without the other, but the historical recognition favoured the combat elements. Truck drivers who enabled every offensive received no medals for valour, appeared in no newsreels, and came home to no parades. Their contribution was acknowledged decades later when historians analysing the war realised that the forgotten truck drivers had been as essential to victory as celebrated infantry divisions. The final accounting of American truck operations in World War II defines achievement beyond military victory. The Transportation Corps moved over 15 million tons of supplies in the European theatre alone, equivalent to the cargo capacity of 15,000 Liberty ships. They transported 7 million personnel to combat zones and evacuated over 1 million casualties to medical facilities. They consumed over 1 billion gallons of fuel transporting fuel to combat units. The trucks drove a cumulative 8 billion miles, equivalent to 16,000 round trips to the moon. These statistics represent more than logistic success. They represent the transformation of warfare from contests of tactical skill between relatively equal forces to industrial competitions where production capacity determined outcomes. The side that could build more trucks, train more drivers, produce more spare parts, and refine more fuel would win regardless of tactical brilliance on the battlefield. German generals trained in a military tradition that valued the decisive battle and the brilliant manoeuvre never fully adapted to this new reality. Even those who recognized American logistics superiority viewed it as somehow unfair, as though winning through superior supply operations was less legitimate than winning through tactical genius. This attitude, visible in post-war German memoirs where authors emphasized German tactical victories while explaining strategic defeat through material factors, missed the essential lesson. The Americans had revolutionized warfare by making logistics the primary weapon. The trucks weren't supporting elements enabling combat forces to fight. The trucks were the strategic weapon that made every other weapon more effective. Artillery without ammunition is scrap metal. Tanks without fuel are bunkers. Soldiers without food are refugees. The trucks transformed potential into reality, making American combat power sustainable where German combat power was episodic. General Oberst Alfred Jodl, in his final strategic analysis written while awaiting execution at Nuremberg, concluded that Germany's defeat had been inevitable from the moment America entered the war. The calculation that led to this conclusion wasn't based on American combat power or British determination or Soviet manpower. It was based on American industrial capacity and, specifically, on the trucks that represented that capacity. Jodl wrote that when German intelligence estimated American truck production at 50,000 vehicles monthly in 1943, he knew the war was lost. No nation in history had produced vehicles at such rates while simultaneously building aircraft, ships, tanks, and weapons. The trucks proved that America could outproduce all Axis powers combined while maintaining quality that exceeded pre-war standards. If America could build trucks at such rates, it could build everything at comparable rates. The mathematical certainty of being buried under American production made continued resistance merely a question of how long Germany could delay the inevitable. The trucks that German generals mocked in 1943 as typical American crudeness, that von Rundstedt watched rolling across France in endless columns in 1944, that German soldiers heard approaching with dread in 1945, represented the true revolution. In military affairs of the 20th century, not tanks or aircraft carriers, though all were important. The revolution was mechanized logistics that enabled industrial democracies to bring their full productive capacity to bear on conflicts. The GMC CCKW and Dodge WC series, ugly, simple, reliable, were the physical manifestation of this revolution. They didn't win battles directly. They made winning battles possible. They didn't defeat German armies through direct combat. They ensured that American armies always had the supplies to defeat German armies that were slowly starving for want of bullets, fuel, and food. The victory they delivered was wholesale, industrial, mathematical, and absolute. At the German Tank Museum in Munster, Germany, a single American GMC truck sits among the Tigers and Panthers and sophisticated German military vehicles. The placard notes it was captured in 1944, examined by German engineers, and retained as an example of Allied equipment. But the real story is told by a quote displayed beside it from the engineer's report. This vehicle represents American industrial philosophy, crude compared to German equivalents, but effective and producible in quantities we cannot match. One German truck is superior to one American truck. 100,000 American trucks defeat 10,000 German trucks, regardless of individual superiority. This is the lesson we learned too late. The American trucks moved an entire army across Europe, then across the Pacific, then rebuilt the world they had helped liberate. They served in Korea, Vietnam, conflicts too numerous to list, civilian roles worldwide, and many still operate today, 80 years after their design. They were mocked by generals who didn't understand that wars are won not by the side with better tactics, but by the side that can deliver more supplies to more places more consistently. The laughter died in the rubble of Berlin, in the faces of German prisoners starving because their supply system had collapsed, in the memoirs of German officers explaining that they had been defeated not by better soldiers, but by better trucks. The mockery turned to respect, then to fear, then to the bitter acknowledgement that they had been wrong about everything that mattered. The Americans won with trucks because wars are won with logistics, and America had built a logistics system that the world had never imagined possible. The post-war analysis conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey examined every aspect of the German war economy, attempting to quantify which factors contributed most significantly to German defeat. The survey, involving over 1,900 investigators who interviewed hundreds of German officials and examined millions of documents, reached conclusions that surprised many military planners. Strategic bombing, while important, ranked below logistics superiority as a factor in German collapse. The report's section on ground transportation was unambiguous. German ground forces were defeated as much by their inability to move supplies as by Allied combat power. American truck superiority created a mobility differential that German tactical skill couldn't overcome. The survey compared German and American logistics performance across multiple metrics. Average delivery distance for supplies increased throughout the war for American forces, from 200 miles in 1943 to over 400 miles by 1945, while German delivery distances decreased from 300 miles to under 100 miles as infrastructure collapsed and fuel shortages intensified. Delivered tonnage per truck per month averaged 180 tons for American vehicles versus 60 tons for German trucks, reflecting both superior reliability and better logistics organization. Most damningly, the survey found that German combat units operated at an average of 40% of authorized supply levels in the final year of war, while American units exceeded 100%, often having surplus stocks that were destroyed rather than transported when units advanced. Dr. Wilhelm Meyer, a German economist who worked on war production planning, was interviewed extensively by survey investigators. His testimony provided insight into German logistics failures from the planning perspective. We knew American production exceeded ours, but we assumed quality differences would compensate. A German truck was engineered to higher standards, more durable, better performance. What we failed to understand was that adequate trucks in overwhelming numbers defeat superior trucks in limited numbers. American trucks broke down more frequently than ours, but they had so many that broken vehicles didn't impact operations. They simply pulled another truck from reserves we didn't have. Our trucks rarely broke, but when they did, we often lacked spare parts and the vehicle was lost. Their system was designed around abundance, compensating for individual vehicle limitations. Ours was designed around scarcity, forcing maximum utilization of limited assets. Abundance won. The cultural dimensions of American logistics success reflected broader American society in ways German planners never anticipated. The American automobile industry, which produced the military trucks, had spent decades perfecting mass production for consumer markets. The concept of planned obsolescence, controversial in commercial contexts, translated to military advantages. American trucks were designed to be replaced, not indefinitely maintained. This philosophy meant simpler construction, fewer precision components, and designs that accepted higher maintenance requirements in exchange for easier repairs. German automotive engineering, by contrast, emerged from a tradition of craftsmanship where vehicles were expected to last decades. German trucks incorporated precision components, sophisticated engineering solutions, and construction quality that emphasized durability. This approach produced objectively superior vehicles, but vehicles that required skilled maintenance, precise replacement parts, and extensive support infrastructure. In the controlled environment of Germany with access to factories and trained mechanics, German trucks outperformed American equivalents. In combat conditions thousands of miles from factories, American trucks proved vastly superior because they were designed for exactly those conditions. The standardization that made American logistics possible extended beyond vehicle design to encompass entire supply chains. The humble jerry can, copied from German designs but produced in quantities that dwarfed German production, illustrated this integration. American factories produced over 60 million jerry cans during the war, enough that they became disposable. Units requisitioned empty cans rather than tracking and returning them. This wastefulness horrified German observers accustomed to carefully tracking every container, but enabled American logistics to ignore constraints that crippled German operations. Fuel logistics particularly benefited from this abundance approach. American units could afford to establish forward fuel dumps with multiple days of supply because they knew resupply convoys would arrive reliably. German units hoarded fuel because they couldn't be certain when the next delivery would arrive. This hoarding created false scarcity that limited German operational flexibility. American abundance created confidence that enabled aggressive operations secure in knowledge that supplies would follow. The human capital advantages America enjoyed in logistics operations became increasingly apparent as the war progressed. American truck drivers arrived in theatre with licenses, having learned to drive in civilian life where automobile ownership was common. German drivers often learned to drive only after military induction, in a society where vehicle ownership was rare. This experience differential meant American drivers could navigate unfamiliar territory, handle vehicles in difficult conditions, and perform field maintenance that German drivers couldn't match. Technical Sergeant James Walsh, a convoy commander with the 534th Quartermaster Truck Battalion, exemplified this capability gap. Walsh had worked as a commercial truck driver in Chicago before induction, accumulating over 500,000 miles of civilian driving experience. His personnel file noted that he could navigate using only maps and compass, repair most mechanical failures without specialized tools, and maintain perfect delivery records over 18 months of combat operations. When asked about German truck operations observed near the end of the war, Walsh's assessment was blunt. Their drivers didn't know what they were doing. I watched a German convoy take 6 hours to move 40 kilometers on decent roads because drivers couldn't maintain spacing, couldn't handle their vehicles efficiently, and stopped for every minor problem. We'd have covered that distance in 90 minutes. They weren't bad. Soldiers, they just didn't have the experience with motor vehicles that every American kid got growing up. The racial integration of transportation units, forced by necessity despite military segregation policies, created an ironic efficiency advantage. Black truck companies, officered by white commanders but operated by black enlisted men and NCOs, often outperformed white units because black soldiers understood that excellent performance was their only path to recognition. The 666th Quartermaster Truck Company, an all-black unit, established records for tonnage delivered and operational time that exceeded every other company in their division. First Sergeant Eddie Donald, the senior NCO in the 6th Disc, kept meticulous records that documented performance exceeding official standards by 40%. His post-war testimony explained the motivation. We knew we were representing every black soldier, knew that white officers were waiting for us to fail so they could say we weren't capable. So we made damn sure we didn't fail. My drivers worked longer hours, maintained their vehicles better, and delivered more tonnage than white companies that had better equipment and easier assignments. We proved that black soldiers could match or exceed anyone, though it took decades before the Army officially acknowledged it. The ammunition logistics supporting the truck-delivered supply system revealed the scale of American industrial integration. Ammunition consumption in the European theatre averaged over 5 million rounds of small arms ammunition daily, plus 100,000 artillery shells, 2,000 mortar rounds, and thousands of grenades, rockets, and other munitions. Every round had to be manufactured in the United States, shipped across the Atlantic, unloaded at ports, transported to forward dumps, and distributed to units. The complexity of managing this supply chain while ensuring the right ammunition reached the right units at the right time required coordination that German logistics never achieved. Major Samuel Katz, an ammunition supply officer with the Third Army, described the system's sophistication. We tracked ammunition by lot number from factory to foxhole. Every shipment had documentation showing when it was manufactured, where it was stored, which ship transported it, which trucks delivered it. This traceability meant we could identify and remove defective lots before they reached combat units. We could forecast consumption based on operational tempo and pre-position supplies where they'd be needed days before units arrived. German ammunition supply, from what we learned examining captured dumps, was chaotic by comparison. Mixed lots, incomplete records, ammunition stored improperly. They had plenty of ammunition in many locations, but couldn't get it where needed because their transportation and tracking systems couldn't handle the complexity. The medical evacuation system integrated with truck logistics saved thousands of lives while demonstrating American organizational sophistication. Ambulances, built on the same chassis as cargo trucks, operated in dedicated medical convoys that moved wounded from aid stations to field hospitals to evacuation hospitals to ports for transport home. The system processed wounded soldiers with efficiency that resembled industrial production, though this comparison disturbed medical personnel who saw soldiers as patients, not products. Captain Ruth Schneider, an army nurse serving at a field hospital in France, witnessed the evacuation system's effectiveness daily. Wounded arrived by ambulance convoys that ran like scheduled bus routes. Every 6 hours, 30 to 40 ambulances arrived with new patients and departed with patients stable enough for transport to rear hospitals. The organisation was remarkable. Triage at aid stations, initial treatment at clearing stations, surgery at field hospitals, recovery at evacuation hospitals, transport home from ports, every step integrated with truck schedules. A soldier wounded at the front could be in an English hospital within 24 hours, impossible in previous wars. The trucks that brought us supplies and ammunition left carrying men they'd helped save by delivering medical supplies forward. The statistical analysis of casualty evacuation illustrated the system's impact on survival rates. American wounded in the European theatre had a survival rate exceeding 96% if they reached medical facilities alive. This compared to roughly 85% in World War I and under 70% in the Civil War. The improvement reflected both medical advances and logistics that delivered wounded to surgeons within hours rather than days. German wounded, by contrast, often lay for days before evacuation because transportation assets didn't exist or couldn't reach forward areas. Oberarzt Friedrich Hoffmann, a German medical officer captured in late 1944, was shown American medical evacuation operations during his internment. His reaction, recorded in camp records, revealed the gulf in capabilities. I watched ambulances arrive in steady streams, unload wounded, receive fresh supplies, and depart for the front. The organisation was factory-like. At German aid stations, we waited days for transport that often never came. Wounded died not from their injuries but from exposure and infection because we couldn't evacuate them. The Americans saved soldiers we would have lost simply because they had trucks available exclusively for medical purposes. We used whatever vehicles we could find, often ox carts or captured vehicles. The contrast showed which nation valued its soldiers' lives. The The quartermaster operations supporting the truck fleet extended beyond vehicle maintenance to encompass every aspect of soldier support. Laundry units, bath units, graves registration, postal services, all operated using the same truck fleet that moved ammunition and fuel. This integration meant that soldiers received mail from home with the same reliability as ammunition resupply, maintaining morale through tangible connections to the society they were fighting to protect. The postal system particularly demonstrated organizational capability. Army post office units handled over 2 billion pieces of mail annually by 1944, delivering letters to soldiers who moved constantly and whose addresses changed daily. A letter from home, mailed in Iowa, reached a soldier in a frontline foxhole in France in an average of 10 days. The system required coordinating with Transportation Corps to reserve truck space for mail, establishing postal routing centres near supply dumps, and training postal clerks in the military geography necessary to track units. Private First Class Anthony Russo, serving with the 34th Infantry Division, later recalled that mail delivery was the single most important morale factor. We could handle lousy food, cold weather, constant danger, all of it, as long as we got mail from home. Letters reminded us we were fighting for something real, people we loved who were waiting for our return. The fact that mail arrived regularly, even when we were moving constantly, proved that someone cared enough to maintain the system. German prisoners told us they hadn't received mail in months. Their postal system had collapsed along with everything else. That psychological impact, being cut off from home while fighting a losing war, broke German morale as much as combat losses. The graves registration operations, perhaps the most somber aspect of logistics, demonstrated American commitment to honouring those who fell. Graves registration units operated throughout liberated territory, recovering remains, documenting casualties, and establishing cemeteries. The same trucks that brought supplies forward carried the dead rearward, ensuring that every American who fell would be accounted for and honoured. This commitment extended to enemy dead, with German remains also documented and properly buried despite no reciprocal German effort for Allied dead. Lieutenant Daniel McCarthy, a graves registration officer, wrote in his journal about the moral burden of this work. We processed over 200 bodies daily during heavy fighting. Each one was documented, personal effects collected for return to families, remains prepared for burial. It was emotionally devastating work that most soldiers never witnessed. But it was essential. Every soldier knew that if he fell, he'd be brought home, or at least properly buried with his name known. Germans we processed had no such assurance. Many carried letters to families that would never be delivered because German postal systems had collapsed. The contrast showed civilizational differences. We honoured even our enemies' dead. They often didn't honour their own. The Red Ball Express, which operated from August to November 1944, became legendary but also illustrated systemic problems that American abundance masked. The express routes, dedicated exclusively to high priority, supplies moved critical items forward rapidly but at enormous cost. Trucks ran continuously with minimal maintenance, resulting in breakdown rates exceeding 30%. Drivers operated in dangerous states of exhaustion, causing accidents that killed dozens. Fuel consumption by the trucks themselves exceeded 40% of transported cargo on some routes. These inefficiencies would have been catastrophic in a logistics system operating at capacity limits. For America, they were acceptable costs because reserve trucks, replacement drivers, and surplus fuel existed to compensate for wasteful practices. The Red Ball succeeded not because it was efficient, but because American logistics could afford to be inefficient. This realization troubled efficiency-minded planners, but illustrated a fundamental advantage. A nation with unlimited resources can accept waste that would cripple a resource-constrained adversary. Colonel John Tilson, analysing Red Ball operations for the Army's Logistics School in 1946, concluded that the express system would be studied as an example of successful emergency logistics, despite violating every principle of efficient transportation management. We ran trucks into the ground, exhausted drivers to dangerous levels, consumed fuel at rates that made no economic sense, and delivered supplies at cost 3 times normal rates. It worked because we could replace everything we broke. The lessons for future conflicts are troubling. If America faces a peer competitor with comparable resources, we can't rely on abundance to compensate for inefficiency. Red Ball succeeded against Germany because Germany couldn't match our waste. not because our methods were sound. The transition from wartime logistics to post-war occupation demonstrated the flexibility of truck-based supply systems. As combat operations ended, the same trucks that had carried ammunition began carrying food aid to starving civilian populations. The same drivers who had delivered fuel to tank columns now transported care packages and medical supplies to displaced persons camps. This rapid transition from military to humanitarian operations was possible only because the logistics infrastructure was vehicle-based rather than rail-dependent. The humanitarian operations conducted by American forces in occupied Germany prevented mass starvation, an epidemic disease that would have killed millions. Trucks delivered over 1,000 tons of food daily to German civilians in the American occupation zone during winter 1945-46. Medical supplies, fuel for heating, and construction materials for rebuilding all moved on the same truck fleet that had delivered military supplies. This generosity toward a defeated enemy astonished Germans, who had been told Americans were barbaric plutocrats interested only in domination. Frau Elisabeth Weber, a Berlin housewife who survived the immediate post-war period, recorded in her diary the impact of American supply operations. "We expected to starve. The Nazis had told us Americans would take revenge for the war. Instead, American trucks arrived with food. Soldiers distributed rations to children first, then families. They organized soup kitchens, delivered coal for heating, brought medicine for the sick. The same trucks that had brought the armies that defeated us now brought the supplies that kept us alive. This generosity, when we deserved none, changed how Germans viewed Americans. The Marshall Plan succeeded partly because Germans had seen that American promises of aid were backed by trucks that actually delivered. The Marshall Plan itself, beginning in 1948, relied heavily on transportation systems developed during the war. American trucks, both new production and refurbished wartime vehicles, formed the backbone of supply distribution throughout Europe. The administrative systems developed to track military supplies were adapted to manage economic aid. The drivers and maintenance personnel who had served in transportation units often remained in Europe as civilian contractors operating aid convoys. The transition from military logistics to economic reconstruction was seamless because both relied on the same fundamental capability, moving large quantities of supplies reliably over long distances. The Chinese nationalist experience with American truck logistics provided a contrasting case study in how organizational factors mattered as much as equipment. The United States provided nationalist forces with thousands of trucks through Lend-Lease and post-war assistance. These vehicles, identical to those serving effectively in Europe, failed to create comparable logistics advantages in China because the organizational sophistication to employ them effectively didn't exist. General Albert Wedemeyer, commanding American forces in China, repeatedly reported that nationalist armies possessed equipment comparable to American units, but couldn't utilize it effectively. "We've given them thousands of trucks, tens of thousands of tons of supplies, training in American logistics methods, yet their supply operations remain chaotic. Trucks sit idle for lack of fuel while fuel dumps exist 50 miles away. Supplies pile up at railheads because no one organizes convoys to distribute them. Officers hoard resources rather than trusting the supply system to replace consumed stocks. The problem isn't equipment, it's organizational culture. American logistics succeeds because generations of Americans have internalized industrial organization principles. You can't transfer that cultural foundation with equipment deliverers." This observation, buried in classified reports that remained secret for decades, identified a crucial factor in logistics effectiveness that military planners had overlooked. Trucks alone didn't create American logistics superiority. Trucks plus industrial organizational culture plus mechanical aptitude plus administrative sophistication plus abundance mindset created the system. Transferring vehicles without transferring the cultural and organizational context produced limited results. The Korean War, beginning in 1950, tested whether American logistics capabilities had atrophied during the post-war drawdown. The initial North Korean invasion found American forces in Japan undermanned, under-equipped, and unprepared. But the logistics systems, though degraded, remained functional. Within weeks, the same transportation core procedures developed in World War II were establishing supply networks in Korea. Many of the trucks moving supplies were World War II veterans, hastily refurbished and returned to service. The Korean logistics experience validated World War II lessons while revealing new challenges. The mountainous terrain and primitive road network limited truck mobility in ways European conditions hadn't. Chinese intervention, bringing masses of infantry supplied largely by porters, created a mobility mismatch where American mechanical superiority was partly negated by terrain that favoured foot movement. Yet even in suboptimal conditions, American truck logistics maintained supply levels that enabled firepower advantages that compensated for numerical inferiority. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Gibbs, a logistics officer in Korea who had served in Europe during World War II, noted the continuity of methods and equipment. "I'm coordinating convoys using the same procedures we used in France, with trucks built for the last war. The drivers are different, the terrain is worse, but the fundamentals remain. Establish supply dumps, calculate consumption rates, dispatch convoys on schedules, maintain vehicles, track supplies. The system works because it was designed around principles that transcend individual conflicts. As long as America maintains truck production capacity and organizational sophistication, we can establish effective logistics anywhere." The evolution of American military thought in the 1950s and 60s increasingly emphasized logistics as the foundation of military power. The concept of tooth-to-tail ratio, measuring combat forces versus support forces, became a planning metric. Critics argued American forces were support-heavy, with too many logistics troops relative to combat forces. Defenders countered that support superiority enabled combat effectiveness that more than compensated for smaller frontline strength. General Maxwell Taylor, Army Chief of Staff in the 1950s, articulated this defense in testimony to Congress. Other nations field armies that are largely combat forces with minimal support. They achieve higher tooth-to-tail ratios, but their combat forces operate at partial effectiveness due to supply limitations. American forces have lower ratios, but our combat units operate at full effectiveness continuously. A German division in World War II might have been 80% combat troops, but it fought at 50% effectiveness due to supply shortages. An American division that was 60%, combat troops fought at 100% effectiveness because supplies always arrived. Effectiveness matters more than ratios. The Vietnam War would test this doctrine under conditions that challenged every assumption about mechanized logistics. The lack of road networks, the insurgent threat to supply convoys, the environmental degradation of vehicles in tropical conditions, all created problems that World War II experience hadn't prepared for. Yet even in Vietnam, truck-based logistics remained fundamental to American operations. The famous road security missions that consumed enormous combat resources existed because protecting supply convoys was essential to maintaining operations. The Strategic Hamlet Program, the pacification efforts, the construction of fire support bases all depended entirely on truck-delivered supplies. When North Vietnamese forces cut Highway 1, the coastal route, American operations in northern provinces were immediately constrained. The vulnerability of road-based logistics to interdiction became a strategic weakness that insurgent forces exploited effectively. Yet even in this challenging environment, American logistics delivered supplies in quantities that amazed observers. Fire support bases in remote locations received hot meals, mail, construction materials, and ammunition in quantities that enabled comfort and firepower unimaginable to Vietnamese forces on both sides. The helicopters that became symbols of Vietnam mobility supplemented but never replaced trucks as the primary logistics delivery system. Specialist Robert Hartman, a truck driver with the 8th Transportation Group in Vietnam, experienced the evolution from World War II methods to counterinsurgency-adapted logistics. "We ran convoys that looked like World War II operations but moved through hostile territory where every bridge could be mined, every curve could hide an ambush. Trucks that had carried supplies peacefully in Europe now moved with gun trucks, armoured vehicles mounting machine guns, protecting the convoy. We wore flak jackets and carried rifles because drivers were targets. The fundamentals remained, move supplies from point A to point B, but the execution adapted to threats World War II drivers never faced." The contrast between American and North Vietnamese logistics in Vietnam illustrated how different logistical philosophies could both achieve effectiveness in different contexts. American truck-based mechanical logistics moved enormous tonnages at high speed but required secure roads and extensive infrastructure. North Vietnamese porter-based human logistics moved tiny quantities at slow pace but operated anywhere regardless of terrain or security conditions. Neither system was inherently superior. Each was optimized for different strategic circumstances. The lesson? recognized by perceptive analysts, was that American logistics dominance depended on conditions that favored mechanical transportation. Where those conditions existed, American capabilities were overwhelming. Where they didn't, American advantages diminished. This realization would influence military planning for decades, driving development of capabilities like vertical lift, air mobility, and eventually precision airdrop that could deliver supplies without vulnerable ground lines of communication. The technological evolution of military trucks from the 1950s through the 1980s produced vehicles with capabilities that would have seemed impossible to World War II planners. The M35 series, successors to the GMC CCKW, featured automatic transmissions, power steering, turbocharged engines, and central tyre inflation systems that allowed drivers to adjust tyre pressure for different terrain without leaving the cab. These sophisticated vehicles outperformed their predecessors in every measurable category. Yet reliability and maintainability declined as sophistication increased. The simple mechanical systems of World War II trucks could be repaired by soldiers with basic tools and limited training. Modern trucks with electronic engine management, hydraulic systems, and computerized diagnostics required specialized training and equipment. The trade-off between capability and maintainability that World War II designs had balanced shifted toward performance, accepting increased maintenance complexity. This shift troubled logistics planners who remembered that World War II had been won partly because simple trucks could be kept running by ordinary soldiers under field conditions. Master Sergeant Raymond Foster, a maintenance supervisor with 35 years of service spanning from Korea to Gulf War, articulated this concern in his retirement interview. The trucks we have now are better in every way than the old Jimmies. More power, better ride, easier to drive, more capable. But when they break, and everything eventually breaks, repairing them requires diagnostic computers, specialized tools, and training that most mechanics don't have. In World War II, a good mechanic could fix almost anything with a wrench and determination. Now, many problems require factory-level support. We've gained performance but lost robustness. I'm not sure that's a good trade for military vehicles that need to operate in the worst conditions imaginable. The Gulf War in 1991 validated modern logistics capabilities while revealing continued relevance of World War II lessons. The deployment of over 500,000 American personnel to Saudi Arabia, with all their equipment and supplies, required transportation operations rivaling the World War II build-up. The same transportation corps that had managed convoys across France now managed convoys across Saudi Arabia, using updated equipment but fundamentally unchanged procedures. The ground campaign, lasting only 100 hours of intensive combat, was supported by logistics that delivered supplies at rates exceeding any previous conflict. Fuel consumption exceeded 1 million gallons daily. Ammunition stocks positioned forward totaled over 40,000 tons. The logistics build-up that made this possible took 6 months and involved moving supplies from ports to forward positions across hundreds of miles of desert using truck convoys that operated around the clock. Colonel Stephen Anderson, a logistics planner for Gulf War operations, explicitly referenced World War II experience in his planning. We studied Red Ball Express operations because the challenges were similar. Move maximum supplies over maximum distance in minimum time, accepting inefficiency if necessary to achieve operational goals. We used modern trucks with GPS navigation and satellite communications, but the fundamental concepts came from 1944. Establish dedicated routes, maintain continuous flow, position maintenance support forward, accept high operational tempo even at cost of increased wear. The technology changed, but the principles remained constant. The post-Gulf War analysis by Army logistics schools identified sustainment operations as the campaign's true center of gravity. Iraqi forces, despite impressive combat power on paper, collapsed partly because their logistics had been devastated by air campaign and lacked organizational sophistication to reconstitute supply systems. American forces, fighting at the end of extremely long supply lines, maintained full combat effectiveness because logistics systems functioned flawlessly. The comparison to German experiences in World War II was explicit in several analyses. The Iraqis, like the Germans before them, discovered that tactical competence without logistics support results in defeat. American forces, like their predecessors in Europe, demonstrated that superior logistics enables sustained operations that wear down even well-armed opponents. The technological differences between 1944 and 1991 were vast, but the strategic logic was identical. The evolution of commercial logistics in the late 20th century, influenced heavily by military innovations from World War II, created capabilities that eventually fed back into military applications. Containerization, pioneered by commercial shipping, was adapted for military use. Just-in-time inventory management, developed for manufacturing, influenced military supply planning. Computer tracking systems, created for commercial transportation, were adapted to track military supplies with precision impossible in earlier conflicts. This civilian-military logistics fusion represented the fulfillment of principles established in World War II. The industrial integration that enabled wartime truck production had evolved into peacetime logistics networks that could be militarized when needed. The truck drivers who had won World War II by delivering supplies became the commercial drivers who sustained the American economy. The organizational methods developed to manage wartime convoys evolved into commercial practices that managed global supply chains. The symbolic and actual importance of trucks in American military culture remained strong into the 21st century. The logistics branch insignia, featuring a truck wheel and crane, was worn by tens of thousands of soldiers whose roles descended directly from World War II transportation troops. The institutional knowledge, passed from veterans to new soldiers across generations, maintained continuity of purpose and method that spanned conflicts. Sergeant Major Maria Gonzalez, serving as the senior logistics NCO for a heavy brigade in Afghanistan in 2010, represented this continuity. Her grandfather had driven trucks in the Red Ball Express. Her father had served in transportation in Vietnam. She managed supply operations using satellite communications and automated inventory systems he couldn't have imagined. But the fundamental mission remained identical to what her grandfather had done: move supplies forward, maintain vehicles, enable combat operations through reliable logistics. In an interview for an Army oral history project, Gonzalez reflected on this continuity. "My grandfather told me stories about driving through France, exhausted, scared, determined to get supplies forward because soldiers were depending on him. I felt the same emotions managing convoys in Afghanistan. The technology is completely different, the threats are different, but the responsibility is identical. Combat troops depend on logistics troops to enable their operations. That dependency creates a bond and obligation that transcends generations and conflicts. Every logistics soldier is part of a tradition that goes back to those World War II drivers who proved that wars are won by delivered supplies, not just brave soldiers." The academic study of military logistics, which barely existed before World War II, became an established field partially because American truck operations demonstrated that logistics could be systematically analyzed and optimized. Graduate programs in logistics management, professional journals dedicated to supply chain analysis, and consulting firms specializing in logistics planning all descended from wartime innovations. Dr. James Thompson, a logistics professor who spent decades studying World War II supply operations, concluded that the conflict represented the first truly modern logistics campaign. Previous wars had managed logistics through experience and intuition. World War II introduced systematic analysis, mathematical optimization, and industrial management principles to military supply. The trucks were the tools, but the real innovation was applying scientific management to the chaos of war. That innovation, more than any weapon system, determined the war's outcome and established principles that remain valid today. The preservation of World War II logistics vehicles in museums worldwide ensured that physical reminders of this achievement remained accessible to new generations. The massive CCKW trucks, lovingly restored by veterans organizations and historical societies, appeared at parades, air shows, and public events. Children climbed into cabs that had carried supplies across Europe. Veterans ran hands over fenders they remembered maintaining under combat conditions. The trucks became tangible connections to a conflict that had reshaped the world. At the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, a GMC CCKW sits prominently displayed, surrounded by interpretive panels explaining logistics operations. Museum director Stephen Ambrose insisted on including logistics exhibits because most military museums focus exclusively on combat operations. His statement at the exhibit's opening captured the importance. Most visitors come to see tanks, aircraft, and weapons. They want to hear about battles and heroes. But we fail in our educational mission if we don't explain that all those battles were enabled by logistics most people never consider. This truck represents the thousands of vehicles that made American victory possible. It's not as glamorous as a P-51 or a Sherman tank, but it's arguably more important because without trucks like this, the P-51s don't get fuel and the Shermans don't get ammunition. The modern American military, despite revolutionary changes in technology and doctrine, remains fundamentally dependent on truck-based logistics for the majority of supply delivery. Aerial resupply, widely discussed in military journals, represents less than 5% of total tonnage moved. The vast majority still moves on trucks that trace their lineage directly to the GMC and Dodge vehicles that won World War II. The family of medium tactical vehicles, the current generation of military trucks, incorporates technology that would seem magical to World War II drivers. Automated transmissions, anti-lock brakes, traction control, armoured cabs, self-recovery winches, run-flat tyres, and communication systems that provide real-time location tracking. Yet the mission remains identical to 1944. Move supplies from point A to point B reliably regardless of conditions. The institutional memory of World War II logistics success, maintained through doctrine, training, and organisational culture, ensures that lessons learned at such terrible cost aren't forgotten. New officers attending logistics courses study Red Bull Express operations as case studies in emergency sustainment. NCOs learn vehicle maintenance using manuals that reference procedures developed for World War II trucks. The continuity of knowledge spanning 8 decades represents organisational learning at its most effective. The global proliferation of logistics capabilities, heavily influenced by American methods and equipment, created a world where the kind of supply operations that seemed impossible in 1940 became routine by 2000. Commercial logistics companies moved more tonnage daily than entire World War II armies consumed monthly. The supply chain sophistication that gave America decisive advantages in 1944 became baseline expectations in global commerce by the 21st century. This democratization of logistics capabilities meant that the American advantage, once overwhelming, diminished as other nations adopted similar methods and acquired similar equipment. The trucks that had been revolutionary in 1944 were commodity items by 2000, available to any nation with modest industrial capacity. The organizational knowledge that had been uniquely American was taught in business schools worldwide. The logistic superiority that had helped win World War II required constant innovation to maintain. General Peter Schoomaker, Army Chief of Staff from 2003 to 2007, addressed this challenge in speeches emphasizing that future American logistics superiority would depend on speed and flexibility rather than sheer volume. In World War II, we won through overwhelming supply quantities delivered reliably. Future opponents will have learned those lessons and developed comparable capabilities. Our advantage will come from delivering exactly what's needed, exactly when and where it's needed, faster than opponents can respond. This requires logistics systems even more sophisticated than what won World War II, systems that use information technology to achieve precision that compensates for potentially smaller volume advantages. The full historical accounting of American truck logistics in World War II reveals achievement that shaped the modern world in ways far beyond military victory. The industrial mobilization that produced the trucks demonstrated American economic power that influenced Cold War calculations. The organizational innovations that managed truck operations established management principles taught globally. The cultural confidence that abundance mindset created influenced American approaches to challenges far beyond military logistics. The trucks themselves, simple machines built in enormous quantities under desperate circumstances, became symbols of American industrial capability and national character. Not technically sophisticated, not aesthetically impressive, but overwhelmingly effective through sheer numbers backed by organizational competence. This combination of quantity and quality, of industrial capacity and managerial sophistication, defined the American approach to challenges that would persist long after the war ended. The German generals who mocked American trucks learned, at terrible cost, that industrial logic defeats tactical brilliance when conflicts extend beyond brief campaigns. The trucks that seemed crude and wasteful proved decisive because modern warfare rewards sustainability over ephemeral tactical success. This lesson, written in the rubble of German cities and the graves of German soldiers, established principles that shaped military thinking for generations. The ultimate vindication of American truck logistics came not in any single battle or campaign, but in the cumulative weight of supplies delivered across years of sustained operations. Every shell fired, every gallon of fuel burned, every meal eaten, every wounded soldier evacuated depended on trucks that never stopped coming. The psychological impact of this reliability on both American soldiers who trusted it and German soldiers who faced it was as militarily significant as any weapon system. The mechanics who kept the trucks running, the drivers who pushed them to limits and beyond, the planners who coordinated their movements, the factory workers who built them, collectively won World War II as surely as any infantry assault or armoured breakthrough. Their contribution, mostly forgotten in popular histories that celebrate combat, was recognised by the German commanders who understood that they had been defeated not by better soldiers, but by better supply chains. General Oberst Alfred Jodel's final assessment, written while awaiting execution, acknowledged this reality without bitterness, but with the clarity of complete defeat. Germany was conquered by an opponent who understood that modern war is won in factories and logistics depots as much as battlefields. The Americans didn't fight the war we expected or the war we were prepared for. They fought an industrial war where the side that could deliver more supplies more reliably would win. Their trucks, mocked by officers who didn't understand modern warfare's true nature, proved to be the decisive weapon system of the conflict. We learned too late that the rumble of approaching truck convoys was the sound of inevitable defeat.